Hey, my name is Norm Friesen, and I am a professor at Boise State University. I work in the area, or teach rather, in the area of educational technology, but I do a lot of research in pedagogy and also in phenomenology, both as a philosophy and as a research method. So I was really pleased to receive the invitation from Felicity Healy-Benson to participate in this conference, and I'm grateful to have a few minutes of your time to talk to you about what I understand to be the connection between phenomenology and pedagogy in particular. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by talking about my own journey in understanding the interconnection of phenomenology and pedagogy. And I arrive at the conclusion that the two cannot be viewed separately. In fact, the two need to be viewed closely together and in a way that is quite different from the way that the two are typically conceived, I think. So first of all, I try to answer the question, what is pedagogy? And then I ask about how it might be related to phenomenology. Then I talk about pedagogical experiences that can be studied and understood phenomenologically that unfold in space and time, because there's a particular kind of space and time, I believe, that is pedagogical. And then I talk about the idea of the dignity of pedagogical practice, or the dignity of practice in general, and how it relates to a theory and a way of understanding theory that respects the dignity of practice, unlike the kind of theory that we have today typically in education, which I think sees no dignity in practice. So in talking to you about this, I look at three sources in particular. Now, I know that Max van Manen has come out with books on phenomenology of practice and translations and other materials that relate to the idea of phenomenology as studying practice. But I actually returned to van Manen's earlier book, his first book really on phenomenology, that's titled Researching Lived Experience, because only in this book, surprisingly, does van Manen actually give a account of the way that pedagogy is phenomenological and phenomenology is, in a certain sense, intrinsically pedagogical. Another source that I talk about in discussing my understanding of pedagogy and phenomenology is a short, wonderful presentation really by a guy named Otto Friedrich Bollnow. He was a student of Heidegger's in Germany, and he did a lot of writing about and thinking about the relationship between phenomenology, Heidegger's existentialism, and pedagogy. Then I'm going to talk or use another source that is going to be published soon, and it is a book of translations and of introductions that I've put together called Tact and the Pedagogical Relation, and this should be coming out from Peter Lang sometime in this year, I hope. So let me begin with van Manen, though. Again, going back to van Manen's earlier writings, it's interesting to see how he emphasizes the connection between pedagogy and phenomenology. And the way that he does this, and to a large degree, is simply in terms of talking about a strong pedagogic orientation or perspective that informs, that underlies, that gives orientation and value to what is being done phenomenologically. So van Manen says that a strong pedagogic orientation requires that one reads any situation in which an adult finds himself or herself with a child as a pedagogic situation. So the situation needs to be read as particularly pedagogical. And in this sense, it is read also as an answer to the question of how we should be and act with children. Now, there's a couple of points that are really key here. Van Manen uses the word how we should act and be with children. So he's indicating that pedagogy is a practice that is intrinsically and inescapably ethical. He talks about reading any situation in which an adult finds himself or herself with a child. This suggests that one can understand these situations and understand the child from a hermeneutic perspective, which implies reflection, which implies the idea that there's no explanation to what might happen in a moment with a child, but rather there are only there's only better understanding that can be developed by, on the one hand, working with one's pre-understandings, and at the same time also correcting one's own pre-understandings based on reflection, based on evidence, based on new ideas, and rereading a situation, for example. Now, the other thing that's important about pedagogy in this regard is that there's always what is called a pedagogical difference. So there's somebody who is a pedagogue, and there's somebody who is somehow being educated. This doesn't mean that they have to be an adult and a child, although that is very often the case, that it is an adult and a younger person. Pedagogy, Van Manen continues in his 1997 book, announces itself not as an entity, not as a behavior, a feeling, or emotion, but rather it announces itself precisely through these things. This is really important to us because what it means is that phenomenologically, pedagogy is available to us not as a specific object, but rather as a general mode of relationship. It's a set of ways in which we experience the world as parents, as adults, as educators with others. Another way to say, or to sum up what Van Manen is saying here, is that pedagogy is closely tied to dispositions and atmospheres. So again, it's about how it announces itself through feelings and through emotion. Our being with one another, Heidegger says, is, and I'm just sort of, as an aside, quoting Heidegger here, is a matter of atmosphere. They themselves, in other words, our mode of being together, are precisely a fundamental manner and a fundamental way of being. Indeed, of being there. And this always directly includes being with one another. So what Heidegger is saying here is that being with one another is not necessarily just a one way of dealing with the world among others. Instead, it is a way of entering into an emotional space, an emotional atmosphere, and that this very being itself announces itself as a kind of atmosphere, as a climate, as a way of feeling and thinking, as a set of patterns and ways of understanding one another. So, in some ways, you could say that a relationship with another person, for example, a friendship, is what is essential. What is the essence of that relationship is a certain atmosphere or set of atmospheres of being together with that person. Now, pedagogy, one thing that's essential to pedagogy, like I said before, is that there's something called the pedagogical difference. And to have a pedagogical difference between the person who is educating and the person who is being educated means that there's always a relation. And Van Manen, again, in Researching Lived Experience, talks about the pedagogical relation as differing from everyday relations, in that the pedagogue reflectively mobilizes his or her conscious desire and will give direction and shape to their influence. So what Van Manen is talking about here is he's saying that, yes, there is always a pedagogical difference within this relation, and one of the things that marks that difference between the role of the educator and the role of the one being educated is that the educator is trying in some ways to influence the one who's being educated. We can draw a number of inferences from this idea that the person who's educating is attempting to influence the person who's being educated. This generally means that the person who's educating has a goal. This goal doesn't need to be a learning outcome or a prescribed type of behavior. It can simply be the aim to have the child or the person that one is working with realize and understand who they are and fulfill themselves, reach a type of self-fulfillment in their lives. This means, though, that time is structured in a particular way, and this quote comes from the book that I've edited, that I mentioned is coming out. Time is expressed in the relation of the educator to the child, as someone named Herman Knoll says. This time is always doubly determined. It's determined by the love for the child or the person who's being educated as they are, and by the love for their educational goal, what you want or what the child wants to eventually see happen to themselves in the educational contexts. So time is structured by a future orientation, and it's also structured by a kind of tension with the present. And this is discussed in the book also by somebody named Schleiermacher, who asks the question whether educators are in a position to sacrifice the child's present for the sake of their future. A deeply educational or pedagogical question. Space is also experienced in a particular way, and it's also experienced in terms of a type of tension. This is a tension between proximity and distance, between the educator and the one who's being educated. This is experienced in terms of a tension between the personal and professional roles of the teacher, for example, in a classroom setting. But pedagogy also happens outside of the classroom, between parents and child, between two adults, and again, it's a question of whether this type of space and time and relation are experienced. One of the ways to describe this tension is to go back to what I just quoted Noel as saying, and that is, there's on the one hand an affirmation of the person who's being educated in terms of their present, but also a recognition that they are becoming, and that they will be changing, that they will reach their own ideal or their own goal through education. And it's always a question of understanding that one is affirming this present and also moving towards the future. So this is expressed both in pedagogical space and in pedagogical time. And this happens in lived experience in many of the smallest ways that we can imagine. For example, it always comes up when we're talking about pushing and motivating a student perhaps to do better than they've done before, but at the same time also recognizing the importance of being satisfied with what they are able to do as well. Now, when we think about the relationship of pedagogy and phenomenology more closely, and this brings in some of the other texts that I've mentioned, we need to understand what pedagogy is in a certain way. What is this perspective? We already know a couple of characteristics, but Van Manen describes it further, again, back in 1997. As soon as we gain a lived sense of the pedagogic quality of parenting and teaching, we start to question and doubt ourselves. Pedagogy, Van Manen says, is this questioning, is this doubting. It is this negotiation between tensions, between present and future, between who the child is or who they might become. And we ask, did I do the right thing? Did I push them too hard? Am I not allowing themselves to enjoy themselves enough and to enjoy what they're doing in the classroom? Why do some people teach or bring up their children in such a different manner than I do? This is a kind of theory, this questioning and the way that we might answer these questions, that is extremely close to practice. It's very different from the scientific, psychological, and sociological theory that that dominates educational scholarship these days. And unlike those theories, this type of theory, this questioning and this response to these questions begins with the presupposition of the dignity of practice. The dignity of practice is something that arises because practice exists independently from theory. Practice has been undertaken without people necessarily appealing to a theory. Practice is something that has happened over the centuries and the millennia without any theory being present. And its relationship to theory, because it has its own dignity, its own independence, is one in which it makes practice more conscious, precisely through this type of questioning and one's responses to this question, and one's awareness of, for example, of pedagogy as a kind of emotional and thoroughly relational set of types of practice. The task of such a theory, in other words, is to make us aware of what is already given to us. And that's a quote from Bolno and the paper that I've translated of his. Theory in this sense makes us more aware of our practice. And it makes us aware in different ways. It does not prescribe practice, but rather it urges us to work on ourselves as practitioners. And here's how Schleiermacher puts it. And Schleiermacher, again, is one of the people included in my book on tact and the pedagogical relation. Schleiermacher says, a significant part of the activity of the older generation, and here he's talking about older and younger in pedagogy, extends towards the younger. So the older generation invests a lot in young people. And it is less complete or perfect the less aware the older generation is about what it is doing and why it is doing it. Since theory works only in the same way as reflective awareness does for practice. Since when something is done with a truly reflective awareness in life, the full complexity of the task at hand is taken into consideration and not just the necessity of the moment. So you can see here how there's an aim towards developing a type of sensitivity, a type of awareness, a type of an emotional dimension to one's relation that has often been called tact in this context. And this approach is of course something that we can understand in terms of the importance of emotion, in terms of the types of tensions that are involved, in terms of the types of questioning that arise from those tensions, by considering both pedagogy as a practice with its own dignity and phenomenology as a type of questioning and a type of observation and a type of interpretation that takes very seriously the ethical and personal commitment and position that is implied in pedagogy. So it's not a type of phenomenology taken from the perspective of nowhere, but rather it's taken from the perspective of a deep investment and concern with one's own practice and with the person or persons that one is engaged with. So here's a listing of my sources. I invite you to contact me if you'd like to check out anything from my book, Tact and the Pedagogical Relation, Introductory Readings. I'd be happy to send you a table of contents, of course, as well. And you can download and access the Bullnote text from the link that I provide. And finally here, everybody knows how to access Van Manen's text on researching lived experience. Thanks so much for your attention. I'm sorry this has run over just by a little bit, but I appreciate your attention all the more. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.